You're listening to the Jefferson Exchange. I'm Mike Green. Several years ago, in 2022, Oregon voters narrowly approved Measure 114, a landmark gun control referendum designed to tighten restrictions on gun sales. But according to a groundbreaking new study, the response to the effort produced the exact opposite of its intended effect. Firearm sales in Oregon increased. Joining the exchange to explain how this measure backfired is Dr. Katie Bollman, an assistant professor of economics at Oregon State University and co-author of the study. Professor Bollman, welcome to the Jefferson Exchange.
Thank you for having me.
Well, I understand that you're an empirical microeconomist, so let's start with understanding what that is and the work you do at Oregon State.
Yeah, so I'm an empirical microeconomist, which means that I spend a lot of time working with data to try and answer questions about essentially how people respond to different incentives that they might encounter. And I specifically look at this largely in the context of public safety and in the context of various things that touch the courts, be that evictions, child maltreatment, or looking at things like police policies.
Okay, so how does an economist get involved in studying gun control?
Yeah, first off, it's an interesting market, right? It's a fascinating market. It's one that people care about very deeply. And it's one that has kind of multiple layers of, unique characteristics to it. For one, it's really hard to even be able to measure the number of firearms that are sold in a given year. Or the number of firearms that people have that are just kind of owned by various people in Oregon or in the United States. So it's an interesting market, and it's also one where we see folks are very responsive to different changes in the world around them. And so we see lots of increases in buying when we have large scale, highly publicized events like mass shootings or even things like elections. And we have events like, the Measure 114 referendum, where we also see this big increase in gun buying. And so it's a very active market and a market, I think, with a lot of social significance as well.
Okay, did I hear you correctly when you said, or I thought you said, that it's hard to get those numbers? It's hard to quantify?
Yes, it's very difficult. So we don't, in the study that, we've been, or that kind of I'm on here to talk about, in that study, or kind of more broadly, we don't have a good sense of how many firearms are bought within Oregon in a given year. And so we have to use some other techniques to be able to try and get at those numbers, because there is no, for example, centralized repository of the number of firearm transactions that take place. Instead, what we can do is we can look at firearm-related background checks, which are shown to track pretty closely. They trend very similarly to overall numbers of firearm sales. But that's what we kind of have to do in order to be able to get a sense of how many firearms are being bought and sold in Oregon in a given year, is come at it from this other direction of looking at background checks, because we can't actually directly measure those sales themselves.
Okay, so I definitely want to get into the data and the rationale behind all of that. But this is fascinating. We track every car that's bought or sold, every transaction of a motor vehicle. Why aren't we doing that the same with firearms, or are we?
So we aren't doing it the same. So I think firearms are viewed differently than cars are in the United States. And so I think that there are a lot of concerns that folks have around privacy. And so I think it really kind of comes back to that, is that there's this heightened concern over privacy and awareness of whether somebody has bought or owns a firearm, which we don't have that same level of privacy concern broadly in the United States for other things that you might buy, like a car.
Okay, so tell me about the problem of deaths by firearms in the United States and the rates of gun-related suicides, both nationally and in Oregon.
Yeah, so both of these, they're very high in the United States, much higher than we see in kind of economically similar countries. And so we do see very high levels of firearm related homicides, suicides, and accidental deaths in the United States. And so Oregon, I think it's something around 80% of firearm deaths in Oregon actually in a given year, I believe, if I'm remembering correctly, are suicides. And so just kind of a very tragic situation all the way around.
Okay, so the numbers that I saw in 2024, there were 44,000 um, firearm-related deaths nationwide, and 62% of those were suicides, which I just found astounding. And what I'm hearing you say is that in Oregon, in that same year, 80% of gun deaths were suicides.
Yeah, I'd have to double check my number on that, but I think that is the case.
So tell me about the voter referendum in 2022 called Measure 114. What was it designed to do?
Yeah, so Measure 114 had multiple components layered into it. So one of those, and kind of one of the primary components of it, was the implementation of a permit to purchase system. So in Oregon prior to this, there was already universal background checks in place. And so, if you wanted to buy a firearm, you went through a background check process. This added a couple of different components to that process, including a permit, which could potentially be denied for reasons outside of kind of the standard ones, like having a felony conviction on your record. It kind of expanded the ability of law enforcement to deny a permit for one reason or another. It also introduced a requirement for a safety course to be completed in order to acquire that permit. And then there were some costs associated with the permit itself. In addition to that, it also had things like a restriction on high capacity magazines. So this was a referendum that kind of came about. It was, on the ballots for Oregonians. So every voter received it in their mailbox in November of 2022. And it passed by a very slim margin, well under 1% of difference in the vote.
So give me a juxtaposition. What did the data show happening to background checks in the run-up to the 2022 election? And what happened immediately after Measure 114 passed?
This is a great question. So we see a little bit of anticipation of the election in the data. So we see that folks started to buy a few more guns, or a little bit more in terms of firearms, in October relative to what we would have expected if Measure 114 hadn't been on the ballot that November. However, what we really see is that after the election results were known, so after the date of the election, there's this really large increase in firearm buying, again, as we're measuring through these background checks in the state of Oregon. It just really skyrocketed, and it stayed quite high until that judicial stay. So Measure 114, it was very narrowly passed, but it was never actually implemented because it was stopped by the courts in December of 2022, and it has not yet been fully resolved through the courts. And so it was never implemented, but when the judicial stay came down saying that it wasn't going to be imminently implemented, in that December, then we see the gun buying really rapidly taper off to about the levels that we would have expected to see if the election had never taken place.
My guest is Oregon State economics professor Katie Bollman. She co-led research into the impact of Oregon Measure 114, which was passed by the voters as an effort to reduce gun sales in the state. Instead, sales of firearms increased dramatically. Professor, who else worked on the study with you?
So I have these wonderful co-authors at the University of Oregon, Ben Hansen, Garrett Stanford, and Ed Rubin.
So 18 months after the election, how many additional background checks took place in Oregon compared to what we would have expected without the referendum?
Yeah, so 18 months, we look at this, we follow this referendum for 18 months, and we estimate that there was a total of 63,000 additional firearm-related background checks that we don't think we would have seen if Measure 114 had not taken place. And so we think of that as kind of being what we might say like a lower bound or an underestimate of the overall number of firearms that were likely sold as a result of the Measure 114 referendum.
Okay, so is it fair to say that 63,000 more background checks equals 63,000 new gun purchases or people trying to purchase guns?
We actually think it's going to be more new gun purchases than that 63,000. And the reason for that is that one background check can cover more than one firearm. So, for example, if you were to go to a gun shop today and you were to try to purchase 4 handguns, that would only follow under one background check. And so we can't actually see, this is the difference between seeing the background checks and seeing the transactions. We can't see the actual number of firearms that a person has purchased, but we have some kind of some ways to try to get at what that number might be. And we think that it is larger than, on average, one firearm per background check that we observe, and maybe closer to something like 1.1.
Interesting. Now, before this study, it wasn't clear if surges in gun sales were just people who already planned to buy a gun and just moved up their timeline, or if they were brand new buyers that were motivated by the new public policy. What did your research reveal?
Yeah, so one thing that we unfortunately can't really differentiate in this study is whether they are folks who have never purchased a firearm before buying their first ever gun, versus somebody who maybe was a pre-existing owner and is buying another gun. What we can talk about is whether these purchases themselves are ones that were likely to have been pre-planned and just move forward in time versus ones that just came about, were not going to be, taking place, or were not planned to be taking place in the next year and a half after the election, but still took place. So that would be this new demand or these new purchases that we would be talking about here. And what we find is that it's really largely driven by new purchases, that folks who weren't planning to purchase a firearm in the near future ended up buying one because of the Measure 114 referendum.
Now, you said Measure 114 is currently tied up in court, and Oregon lawmakers recently delayed its implementation until at least January 1st, 2028. So, what does this lack of implementation mean for the current number of firearms in Oregon?
This is a great question. And so this is partly where, when I mentioned that 63,000 additional firearm-related background checks number, part of the reason, or a big part of the reason that we have that large of a number is because the law was never implemented. So we anticipate that if the law had been implemented, that would have started to reduce the number of firearm purchases in the state after Measure 114 had been implemented. And so gradually that would have, cut down on that kind of excess number of firearms that were bought in anticipation of the law. That number would have kind of been whittled down over time as the law took effect. Because the law never took effect, we only see that anticipation increase where people went out and they bought firearms because they believed that Measure 114 was going to be implemented, and we never see it decline again as a result of the permit to purchase provision. And so the fact that it was never implemented is kind of a driving reason for why we still have that larger number of firearms that had been sold in Oregon, or the larger firearm stock in Oregon post Measure 114 than if it hadn't appeared on the ballot.
Well, as you know, economic policies do not affect every racial group the same. Did your study look at how this phenomenal public reaction to Measure 114 was broken down by racial categories?
This is a wonderful question. Unfortunately, it's not one that we're really very equipped from the data that we have to be able to answer. And part of that's because we just see within counties the number of firearm-related background checks that took place, but we don't see who the background check is associated with or who might have been purchasing that firearm. And so we can't really nail things down that precisely. The closest that we can do is look at which counties had the biggest increases in firearm purchasing as a result of Measure 114. And on a per capita basis, that looks like it's mostly the places that were more opposed to Measure 114 to begin with, which are largely your more rural counties.
How did that look here in Southern Oregon, Jackson, Josephine counties?
Let's see. I have the map in front of me, or I have it darn close to me. If I scroll real quickly, oh, I apologize. I can't find it. I believe from memory that Southern Oregon was more largely in opposition to Measure 114, and also were some of these counties with the larger increases in the firearm-related background checks. But I don't have a number for you right at hand.
Gotcha. Well, in our last 30 seconds, what's the ultimate takeaway here for policymakers? And how should future gun control legislation be drafted to avoid this kind of backfire?
Yeah, I think this is the case of, right, this was a very highly salient, everybody knew about this potential impending change in the firearm-related policies, even folks who might not have cared that much until it showed up in their mailbox. And so I think this is a case of just keeping in mind that folks really do respond to these kind of salient future potential policy changes. And so there's a world in which we could say, if your goal is to reduce the number of firearms in Oregon, then kind of there's this bad situation you can end up in if folks anticipate that there is going to be a change and then no change actually takes place.
We're going to have to leave it there. We're out of time,
all right.
unfortunately. Thank you
Thank
so
you very
much.
much. Have a good one.